Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Keir Giles, and it's my job to welcome you to this discussion this afternoon hosted by Chatham House, and specifically by Chatham House's Russia and Eurasia program. Now, as you can imagine, that's a program that took a keen interest 6 months ago when Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee released their report simply entitled Russia. And since then, we've been taking a key interest in whether any of the important recommendations that that report made have actually been acted on, or whether they have simply been ignored. Now, everybody's been a bit busy over the last 6 months with pandemics and Brexits and this and that, but most people don't have the luxury of being able to deal with only one problem at a time. And that principle extends to the British government as well. Russia as a challenge hasn't gone away in the meantime, and neither has the responsibility of protecting this country from that challenge. And that's why today we're going to discuss some of those findings of that Russia report. The one that, if you recall, everybody thought was being suppressed because it would show damning evidence of successful Russian interference in our democratic processes, except that, as it turned out, the evidence that was being suppressed was not of Russian success, but of British government failure. In fact, a cascade of failures in the protection of governance and democracy and society. And it's important to bear in mind that the failings and the vulnerabilities that were exposed are not specific to Russia. It could be any actor, state or non-state, that wishes to do harm to the UK, to its government, to its society, to its people, that could exploit any one of these weaknesses. But they have been highlighted specifically in this instance, looking at what Russia is and what Russia does. Let me remind you, the key failing that was identified was that there appeared to be nobody in charge of protecting democratic processes in this country. The phrase hot potato was used. Nobody wanted to take responsibility. And there were other specific problems. Gaps in the law was a recurring theme in the Russian report. Some of the obvious ones, like cyber legislation not being adequate for the rapid pace of development in what devices people use, how they use them, and how people interact online. Legislation that's outdated even for technical crime, never mind for countering malign influence. But there was also the absence of any form of Foreign Agents Registration Act in the UK. And let's not forget, other countries, like for instance Russia, do have this to try to make sure that you limit the influence of people who are working against the interests of your company on behalf of a foreign power. Whereas here, it's completely legal. And let's not forget that covers a vast span of different people working for the interests of Russia as opposed to this country. Everywhere from employees of Russia's state propaganda organizations, like, for example, RT, who is joining us this afternoon, all the way to the other end of the scale, the report implies members of the House of Lords who are salaried employees of Russian major state companies. It's all perfectly legal. Add to that, of course, the more pernicious and invidious forms of malign influence that we as think tankers see on a regular basis. It's the journalists, the academics, the fellow think tankers, the business leaders who consistently and routinely regurgitate to policymakers, to decision makers, to senior military officers, whichever lines Moscow wants to hear them on any given day. We see it all the time, and again, it's perfectly legal. Even in espionage, as the report highlighted, it seems ridiculous that anybody is perfectly at liberty to conduct acts of espionage, but it only becomes a crime if you succeed, if you actually succeed in handing over that purloined secret material to your foreign handler. So huge gaps in the law that ought to be plugged in order to safeguard our society. So we're asking the question, 6 months on, has any of that been done? You will have noticed that the title for this session was a fairly punchy one. Why has nothing been done? I think that moved on from the original version of whatever happened to the Russia report. But either way, I'm hoping that our speakers today are going to, at least in some part, prove the title wrong and say, yes, there has in fact been progress towards dealing with some of these major challenges. Let me introduce the speakers. We have an all-star cast today, as always. First of all, we're extremely lucky to have with us Kevin Jones, Member of Parliament for North Durham and a member of the Intelligence and Security Committee. So, knowing the recommendations of the reports inside out and also knowing the processes by which the British government appeared to suppress its publication, which may account for why you might remember at the press conference releasing the report, Mr. Jones carried away the trophy against stiff competition for the most uses of the word outrage. Next, we have Duncan Allen. Like me, associated with Chatham House's Russia and Eurasia program, unlike me, following decades of experience with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, analyzing and assessing Russia and providing advice on it under successive governments. So I think we can reasonably assume decades spent before he joined Chatham House explaining this problem. Only now he can explain it in public. And I would strongly recommend, if you've not come across it before, a paper that Duncan wrote through Chatham House a year and a half ago, exposing particularly the kinds of policy failures which have now again been highlighted in the Russia report. And Anna Morgan, the Chatham House genie behind the scenes who is making sure everything runs smoothly today, is about to post a link to that in the chat so that you can all pick it up and read it at your leisure. And finally, we'll have Deborah Haynes, Foreign Affairs Editor for Sky News, previously Defense Editor for The Times, who's taken a key interest in this kind of challenge, again, over several years. And Deborah has been delving into this deeply recently. She has started releasing a series, a podcast series, which is the result of almost a year's research and interviewing and collecting material. It's called Into the Gray Zone, and it talks about sub-threshold warfare being waged against this country. And as you can imagine, Russia features quite prominently. Again, Anna is about to post a link to that. I believe, Deborah, you'll tell me if I'm wrong, that 2 episodes have already been released, but there are another 7 still to go. It is packed full of material that will be of interest to anybody listening in with us this afternoon. I'm going to hand over to our speakers in a moment. They will each be sharing their thoughts and comments for up to about 10 minutes each, and then the rest of the time will be open for question and answer, for discussion. I imagine there will be plenty of different topics that the 103 people who are joining today want to bring up for discussion. Let me tell you that this meeting is on the record. A video of it will be posted to the Chatham House website afterwards, and I would ask you please to bear in mind that that may constrain what some of our participants feel comfortable saying, because it is not quite the same as saying it in a private room. So when you pose your questions, please bear in mind, this is public. Everybody will be able to see it afterwards. Now, while our guests are speaking, do please feel free to start typing questions, thoughts, comments in the chat that you see on your screens. And then when we come to the open discussion, we will invite you to put up your electronic hands, which should flag to us that you have something to contribute. But for now, I'm going to get out of the way, and we are going to hear from our expert witnesses. And over to you, Mr. Jones.
Thank you very much, Kieran. Can I, first of all, thank Chatham House for organising today's event and giving the opportunity to talk about the report, but also take stock of where we're at and why progress has been so slow in implementing its recommendations. Can I begin by saying is this forum really should have taken place much earlier, but as we know, the history of the report's delay led to it only being produced in July of last year. The ISC originally agreed on the 23rd of November 2017 to do a report into Russia. Then what followed was another 6 months of, I've got to say, prevarication on behalf of the government in terms of providing the written evidence that we usually get prior to taking witness evidence before the committee. And I've got to say credit to Dominic Greaves, the chair of the committee, who was very persistent in ensuring that this report went ahead. And those delays, I shall say, were at their highest level in government. And we finally concluded our report, and it was sent to the Prime Minister on the 17th of October of 2019. Now, for those people who are not aware of our processes, is a draft report is agreed, then redactions take place and agreements taken with the agencies of what can and cannot be put in the public domain. And then a final report is sent to the Prime Minister. And that was all done by the 17th of October. Customarily, what happens then is the Prime Minister has 10 days in which to publish the report. It's usually a matter of fact that it is published after that, because can I just dispel some of the nonsense that was being talked, why it hadn't been produced before the general election? The idea that somehow that more evidence needed to be looked at or redactions need to be taken place. That is just not true. It had all been done by the 17th of October. But then we had the general election called, and the report wasn't produced. And under the Justice and Security Act, our committee can only publish a report when Parliament is sitting. But there was ample time prior to the general election for the government to have allowed the publication of the report. Then what we had was 7 months in which the government prevaricated in terms of the appointment of the new committee. And credit to the new committee, when it did meet, it took the opportunity to publish the report as soon as possible, which was on the 21st of July of last year. And although the report included many recommendations, it's been tangibly slow in implementing any of them, and there doesn't seem yet still a sense of urgency to address some of the issues, or major issues, which was that Keir referred to early on. And as Keir outlined, our main criticism was that the government took its eye off the ball in terms of Russia. And this is despite Russia being, the UK being one of Russia's key intelligence targets. And we'd seen obviously disinformation and other cyber attacks in terms of US elections. So the question was why the vital piece of work in terms of defending our democratic processes wasn't undertaken. Now, in terms of their response to the report, interestingly, the government responded on the same day with a report which didn't really take on board many of the recommendations we'd made, even though it had had many months in which to do so. The government eventually produced in July 2000 the Defending Democracy review the year earlier. But again, the problem is with that is although the security agencies have contributed to it, there was nobody responsible lead for protecting our democracy. And that's even when we saw clear evidence in the 2019 general election that there was some interference in terms of release of illicit documents concerning the US-UK trade deal. So one of our key recommendations was that in terms of defending democracy, we should have it should be a ministerial priority. And in our view, that the Office of the Security and Counterterrorism should take the policy lead, and that MI5 should take the operational lead on it. So the delay in terms of producing the report meant to clearly a lot of questions and a lot of accusations about what actually happened in terms of both the EU referendum, the Scottish independence referendum, and the general election. Did interference take place? And what we found was the questions hadn't been asked about whether interference had taken place or not. And we look in terms of contrast to what happened in the United States, which undertook a full assessment of potential interference and published the unclassified summary. But it seems to have fallen on deaf ears in terms of the UK government, in terms of being able to look back, but also to put in place those security around our democratic processes. And these are clear national security implications. And again, it seems that the government wished to look away when really what they should have been doing is asking the clear and incisive questions in terms of how you protect our democratic process. Now, Keir mentioned the role of social media, and we'd already highlighted the concerns around social media in our 2017 report in terms of terrorism attacks. And there's been much written in terms of the influence of social media. And we've seen it again clearly in recent weeks in terms of what's happening in the United States, its influence in terms of events. And if you look at what's happening in the United States, is that clearly big tech has responded when it is forced to. But again, we feel that the government is dragging its feet in holding them to be account in the UK. It's promised introduction of an online harms bill, which says it will set out a robust framework for this. But how that links to protecting democracy is unclear, and we're still waiting for that bill. So again, one of our key recommendations about how we protect our democracy in terms of online is still waiting, and it doesn't really seem to be a priority for the government. The other one of our main recommendations, which I think is a huge, has huge national security implications for the UK, and that's the absence of a Espionage Act, which we recommended, something along the lines of the United States' Foreign Agent Registration Act. And it was interesting when we took evidence from Sajid Javid, who was then the Home Secretary, in February 2019. To quote him, he said that the Official Secrets Act was completely outdated. And again, we're now waiting 2 years hence, and there's no indication of when that bill will come forward. But I think in terms of waiting for that counter-hostile state activities bill, that is something which is needed as a matter of urgency to plug a gap which Keir referred to early on, which in many other countries is on their statute books. So I think in terms of the government's response, it's as though the report has been noted and shelved. And I think it is important that we keep pressure in terms of ensuring that some of these issues and legislation does come forward as a matter of course. Now, on a bright note, there is some response from the House of Lords. One of the issues which we raised in our report, and it was about the influence of Russian money in terms of buying influence, and it was referred to, I think, as the London laundromat. It was highlighting the fact that a number of members of the House of Lords had links to, close links and financial links to Russia, but in looking at their register of interests, that it was not enforceable in terms of making sure that they declared what these were. Credit to the House of Lords, by the 30th of November of last year, they'd brought forward a new register, which has now been agreed, which will mean that those members of the House of Lords with direct financial interest will have to register them, which makes sure that the transparency is there in terms of, and that's not suggesting that any of the individuals are doing anything wrong. It's just to ensure that we have scrutiny over links that individuals in the nation's legislature have with a power, not just Russia, but other countries as well. So, are we still playing catch up? Yes, I think we are. But I think there's an issue, I think, about whether there's an intent there to actually take on board some of these recommendations, which clearly highlighted gaps in our security, national security. And it was an opportunity, I think, to make sure that we have the most robust set of frameworks, legislative frameworks, but also organisational frameworks and security to ensure that we protect not only UK government, but also our democratic process from interference. Now, I will now hand over, I think, to Duncan and Deborah for their perspectives. I am, as Keir said, happy to answer questions, but with one caveat is that clearly there is the annex to the main Russia report, which was not made public. So anything I say will only be mentioned around the issues that are already in the public domain. Thanks very much, Keir.
Thank you, Kevin. Yes, there was always a faint hope that you might have said, no, the British government has swung into action and dealt with some of the, or at least started to deal with some of these obvious problems. But it's good to hear at least that strange anomalous disparity between House of Commons and House of Lords, where you have to account so closely for all of your interests, but the House of Lords are the Lords are free to sign up to whatever dodgy deals they wish, was the implication in the report. At least that has now started to be addressed. Duncan, maybe you can give us a little bit of insider insight, not too much given that we're on the record, but what actually are the processes going on behind this, and how might any policy initiatives to deal with this eventually emerge?
Well, thank you, Keir, and good afternoon, everybody. I'll try and cover some of that particular question in the course of my remarks. What I want to say are a few things about the ISC report, a few things about the government response, and then I'll offer a few thoughts about the what next or what is yet to be done question. As regards the ISC report, I think that the report came in for some rather misplaced criticism in some quarters. My understanding of an exercise like this is that ultimately this is part of wider democratic process of holding the government to account. And I think that the report does that pretty well. It's thoughtful, it's comprehensive, it's robust, at times outspokenly so, and it makes a number of concrete policy recommendations. So I regard this report as a serious contribution to an important policy debate. Now, I don't agree with everything in the report. I would disagree, for example, with the contention that Russian foreign policy is fundamentally nihilistic, which is how the committee described Russian foreign policy. I would dispute the contention as well that there are, and I quote, a lot of Russians with very close links to Putin, unquote, in London. Now, that might sound like a detail, but it's an important detail when it comes to assessing the potential dangers arising from illicit finance and influence peddling and what we might do about them. And if I might say so, I think it's also a pity that the committee didn't canvass a greater number of external experts, including perhaps a wider range of opinions on Russia and Russia policy. But all that said, this is a serious and substantive report and a very valuable contribution to the policy debate. Now, the government's response, I found it underwhelming and at times disheartening. I thought that the tone of much of the government's response was defensive and uninformative. Some of the sections they seemed to me to be largely formulaic, seemingly reiterating the latest lines to take on a specific issue. Echoing something Kevin just said, sections of the government's response didn't actually seem to address some important questions, observations and recommendations made by the committee. So I went away with the impression of, unfortunately, a certain reluctance to engage with the committee. And I think that's a real pity. Now, specifically, it's really regrettable that the government continues to refuse to hold an inquiry into Russian interference in the Brexit referendum campaign. Now, let me say as an aside that I remain very sceptical that Russian interference had a material effect on the outcome of the referendum campaign. But as the committee themselves point out in their report, an inquiry that drew such a conclusion would nonetheless offer important reassurance over an issue of some public concern. I would add that it might help to draw a line under the episode and enable us all to focus more wholeheartedly on some of the other issues that really do need urgent addressing. I found that the responses in much of the section of the government's response on anti-money laundering came across as frankly complacent. I'll have a little bit more to say about that in a moment. But my main reservation about the government response was what I perceived to be a continuing lack of clarity as to how the government views the likely trajectory of UK-Russia relations going forward. Now, let me illustrate that argument by making two references. Paragraph 144 of the ISC report, I think it's the last paragraph in the report. I quote, "Whilst it is possible that an improved relationship between Russia and the UK may one day reduce the threat to the UK, it is unrealistic to think that that might happen under the current Russian leadership," unquote. I think that that's one of the most important judgments in the entire report. I happen to agree with it wholeheartedly as well. Unless I missed something, the government did not respond to that judgment. Meanwhile, on page 3 of the government response, there's a discussion of the cross-Whitehall Russia strategy, which was agreed in 2017. And the government described the Russia strategy, and I quote, as designed in the long term to move from a relationship of confrontation and challenge to a relationship where Russia chooses to work alongside the international community, unquote. I'm unclear whether that is a long-term aspiration or an operating assumption. Now, if it's a long-term aspiration, then fine, but that in turn raises a host of other serious questions about the likelihood of such an outcome, and even more so, the extent to which the UK can help to make that happen. If, however, we're talking about an operational assumption, in other words, that the government's proceeding from the assumption that this is the underlying direction of travel, and that relations with Russia are likely to become significantly more cooperative, then I suggest the government is being dangerously optimistic. It could happen, but it may very well not happen. We need greater clarity. This is a basic issue. Why has nothing been done? I think, as Keir has indicated, we've moved on slightly from that title, which I thought was rather unfair, because it could imply that the policy-making process has juddered to a halt since the ISC report was published. I have to say that my assumption, as somebody who is no longer working in Whitehall, is that the policy wheels will still be turning, although they're turning probably more slowly than they ought to be. I'll just offer one related caveat, just to set the scene in terms of where I'm speaking. There were many redactions in the ISC report for understandable security-related reasons. And those same considerations clearly inhibited the government in their response. The government was clearly unable to talk publicly about a whole range of issues. I'm assuming that in the meantime, there are discussions about various sensitive related Russia issues that are taking place behind closed doors, so to speak. So I've taken the liberty of slightly rephrasing this question along the lines of, is enough being done? And my overall answer to that question is largely in line with what Kevin said. I'm not persuaded that it is, and I'll just offer 3 quick examples. So to go back to the issue of anti-money laundering, much more urgency is needed. Since the ISC report, we've now had the so-called Fincen Scandal, which has to do with the leaking of large numbers of suspicious activity reports that were submitted by financial institutions to a bureau of the US Treasury, and which seem to implicate something like, well, more than 3,000 UK registered legal entities, and reportedly involve suspicious activity involving a number of politically exposed Russian interests. We can say more about this in the discussion, I'm sure we will. All I will say here at the moment is that this is doing huge and lasting damage to the UK's international reputation. It really does need to be addressed as a matter of urgency. Secondly, disinformation. The government's response to the ISC report, in my reading, majors very largely on what we might call the supply side of the problem. In other words, looking at things like the government's counter-disinformation unit, how to engage more effectively with content service providers and social media companies, other technical issues. All of that is really important and necessary. Unless I missed something, however, I didn't see much, if anything, about what we might call the demand side of the disinformation challenge. In other words, why is it that there seem to be sections of UK society who are susceptible to potentially or actually damaging Russian information activities? Now, that issue, it seems to me, takes us very quickly into a number of complex and highly contested issues of domestic public policy, which relate to questions like the political legitimacy of established institutions, political alienation, socioeconomic inequality. I'm not pretending that dealing with those issues is going to be straightforward, or there are any short-term fixes, or that they're in all likelihood not going to cost a lot of money. But until we begin to address in a really serious way the demand side of the disinformation problem, I fear we're going to make limited progress. And I think there's a wider lesson here, which is that if we are to deal with the challenge that Russia poses, I believe, to core UK interests over the long term, we have to do better in terms of how we govern ourselves. We have to put our own house in better order. So it means addressing issues like social division. It means building the better resilience within our public institutions to combat more effectively the potentially corrupting impact of illicit finance from Russia and from other countries. Until we get our own house in better order, our ability to deal with the Russia challenge going forward over the long term is going to be inhibited. And I'll just finish with one quick final comment, which is really just to reiterate a point I made earlier. I do believe that we need to have a clearer-eyed and less equivocal view from government about where they think the bilateral relationship with Russia is likely to go over the next 5 to 10 years, because that has to be the basis for any coherent strategy.
Duncan, thank you very much for bringing your experience to bear and stepping back and placing the report in a broader context, especially that fundamentally important point of how the British government thinks its relationship with Russia could actually evolve. After all, it wouldn't be the first country to get the whole topic of improving relations and resets and how exactly to deal with Russia spectacularly wrong. That, I think, is a point we're going to come back to at the very beginning of the Q&A, because we have a question specifically on that, which I'll introduce a bit later on. But before we do, we have Deborah. And Deborah, of course, as well as producing a podcast detailing certain different Russian information operations, you, in common with some of the other participants here today, have actually suffered directly from them. You've been caught up in them and suffered the fallout with personal consequences. So you are no stranger to what Duncan just referred to as damaging Russian information activities. And would I be right in saying that actually that colors your view and exactly what the nature of the threat is?
Well, it certainly helped to shape my view, definitely. I mean, I sort of feel a bit embarrassed speaking alongside two such esteemed experts, because I don't see myself as an expert. I'm just a journalist. But yeah, in terms of my background, I spent a lot of time covering the conflict in Iraq, where you kind of understood. Obviously, it was an unconventional conflict. It was a counterinsurgency campaign, but it was very clear when you were under attack. And I definitely felt, so you started to feel very much under attack in the information space ever since the Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, when we started as journalists covering much more Russia's activities, and suddenly we found ourselves in the front line of this grey zone, which is kind of what inspired me to do this podcast that you've kindly referenced. So yes, so I first of all apologise for not being a huge expert, but I'll tackle this issue from the perspective of a journalist, if that's helpful. The Russia report, obviously it created such a frenzy because a lot of people were expecting it to uncover the smoking gun that confirmed suspicions that there had been some kind of Russian interference in the Brexit referendum. And clearly, it was very compelling, the findings in the report that that question hadn't specifically been directed at the intelligence services. But I think more profoundly than that, and it didn't really come out in the report, but it really does expose how the way that government and our entire country, our society needs to think about the nature of the threat has to change. And I thought it was interesting, so much attention was placed on how, the criticism of the intelligence services and of the government for not showing more curiosity when it came to whether or not there had been some kind of Russian information operation targeting the Brexit campaign, without really going into the complexity of that issue for a democratic society to ask its intelligence services to actually look into a democratic event like an election. There are clearly sensitivities there. And I thought it's understandable that it wasn't put in the report, but I thought it was notable. It's impossible, to talk about the Brexit referendum and information operations related to the Brexit referendum without looking at the domestic political, the domestic interest too, and the fact that you had a Leave campaign and a Remain campaign that were both using disinformation effectively. And so the idea that the difficulty for officials, government officials whose job it is to protect the security of the UK, to be able to then distinguish between what is foreign interference and what is just domestic politicians using the same kind of tactics, that's difficult. Obviously, it's difficult. Just because it's difficult doesn't mean it's not something that needs to be grasped. But it's a debate that I don't think we've had. And unfortunately, we haven't had that debate since. And obviously, part of it's got to be the fact that you've got a prime minister who was very vocal during the Brexit referendum and that slogan, that £350 million Brexit bus slogan that, is just not true. And so dealing with truth and how to protect democracies and democratic events is something that from that Russia report really brought out. And I thought the way, when you look at the US election this time around, the 2020 one, as opposed to the 2016 one, where as things stand, the main body of disinformation there is very much domestic. It's interesting to see how the US agencies, specifically CISA, the one that the American equivalent of our National Cybersecurity Center, they ran a very effective information operation on their Twitter and Facebook pages, flagging up false information related to the election. And clearly the social media platforms did that too, as Kevin Jones highlighted. Although again, that also is another issue that hasn't happened yet. Why are we leaving it up to the technology companies to have to define what is and what isn't acceptable content? It's absolutely understandable that the decision to take Trump off Twitter triggered cries of outrage about a violation of the freedom of speech, which does pose that problem when you're in a democracy, and that enables us to have that treasured value of free speech, but that also provides the freedom to lie. And so what do you do when the freedom to lie undermines the democracy that enables the freedom to express yourself? And it's obviously really complicated, and but it doesn't mean it doesn't need to be addressed. And I think it's really disappointing that that's not more of a active. Everybody knows the problem, but in terms of the government, the politicians that have the power to do something about it, it's just not. It hasn't happened yet, and it's a shame, and that's obviously something that needs to change. Otherwise, all democracies are under threat. And then, in terms of the title of this roundtable about what progress has been made. I'm really struck about behind the scenes, like the officials that work on Russia behind the scenes absolutely understand the threat. They understand the vulnerabilities. They understand, or at least there's a live debate around the kind of things that need to be done to better protect the UK. But it's something that the whole of society also needs to understand. And it's really incumbent upon the political leadership to enable that debate, and it's just not happening. And obviously they've got big issues going on, right? There's like a global pandemic, which is clearly a top priority. They've been dealing with the sort of end of the Brexit transition period, but it's it is gut-wrenching for someone, for people for all of us who actually care about our, protecting our values and our way of life, that you have this moment that the government talked about, this integrated review that was supposed to come up and shape our global policy and help to dictate the structures, the fundamental structural changes that need to happen in the defence and security community in order to meet these threats that are coming at us from this grey zone. And yet it's being delayed and delayed. And when you delay it, it kind of almost becomes downgraded in its importance. And yet it's so important. And just one final point, and then I'll shut up. And that is, and again, the Russia report does kind of bring this out, although it doesn't really address it, that the threat to our society from Russia or any other hostile state, it's not a threat that can be dealt with through the usual ways that we've always grown used to protect us, like the military, the security services. It's a whole of nation threat. And so where, Mark said, had this whole fusion doctrine. Where's the fusion doctrine? It has the right ideas about a whole of government approach and about all departments understanding the threat and understanding the need to build resilience in our society. But where is that in reality? Like, where do people really feel as though they need to change in order to protect who we are as a country? I just don't think that's happening.
Deborah, thank you very much. I think possibly other participants will agree that you're being ever so slightly modest, claiming not to have any expertise, when after all, you've been researching this problem for most of our, and especially given your own experience of being under attack, as you said it, because that does give you a very keen insight into the real impact of some of the problems that we're dealing with. But thank you to all three of you. That worked exactly as we had hoped, because each of you has shone a light on this set of problems that we're facing from a slightly different angle, and it does help give us that overall picture of what's going on and unfortunately how little is actually being done about it. We're going to go over to the open discussion session now, and I'd like first of all to pick up one of the points that Duncan made about the trajectory of the relationship, about how the two sides, the UK and Russia, actually think they might be able to work together in the future. Now, it's normal and natural that, as ever, Russia would be interested in promoting the view that actually you should normalize relations, that we should turn the page, move on, that everything that is past should be disregarded, and dialogue should be restarted. Unfortunately, dialogue is one of those words with a toxic payload that we continually encounter in this business, because it is hard to argue against the need for dialogue. Everybody knows we need to talk to each other. But the subtext, of course, is what you're actually talking about. And what Russia wants is dialogue without preconditions and without an objective in this case, because it counts as part of a normalization of relations. Now, with that in mind, we'll turn to the first question that came in on the chat. And I am going to read out these questions because I know some of the people listening in today are dialing in and so won't, in fact, be able to see what's been posted there. It's a question that's directed to Kevin Jones, and it comes from RT. It comes from Maria Tabak, and it fits into that theme that I've just been mentioning. The question runs, do you believe that there should be some sort of dialogue between the UK Parliament and the Russian Duma? Such dialogue did exist in the past, but now it seems to be completely ceased. Perhaps you could answer that, and maybe if you know, you could say why it's completely ceased.
Well, I think in terms of my position on Russia is, do we want good relations with Russia? Yes, I think we all would want that, but that can't be unconditional. And that's why, certainly in terms of the events we've seen in Ukraine and the Crimea, and also I think in terms of post-Salisbury, for example, the interference and trying to kill some people on our own territory is unacceptable. So would I welcome dialogue? Well, it's got to be dialogue with a purpose. If it's just Russia not facing up to the facts of some of the issues which they're doing, then I think it would be pretty pointless. But does anyone disagree that we should have good relationships with Russia or any other country? No, I don't think we should. We should, but it's got to be conditional. It can't just be, otherwise it just becomes pointless.
Thank you very much. And just a quick apology to Maria Tabak. She points out she is RIA Novosti, not RT. So we have false flagged her today, and our apologies. We're getting a theme coming up in the questions that are appearing in the chat. In fact, two closely related themes. There is government incompetence in general, and government incompetence specifically related to this report. So I'm going to park most of those questions and come back to them hopefully when we can gather them all together into something which we can dispatch with as little time spent on questions back and forth as possible. But before I do that, there is another sub-theme that's come through, particularly one of the questions that we received before we actually started. And I'm going to take Howard Gethin's question. It is, what does the panel think is the reason for nothing having been done? Is this a case of Nelsonian eye, because so many wealthy Russians are bringing in so much bent money to the UK's bankers and lawyers? And then Howard gives us a couple of names, which I am not going to read out because state of British libel law and its attractiveness to Russian oligarchs is a whole other problem that we can discuss a whole other day. Or Howard says, is it just a case of sheer incompetence in not seeing the problem? And similarly, we have had questions from, for example, Timothy Ash. Fundamental question, why has the UK not decided to do nothing with this report? I'll park it there for now. There are some more detailed and specific questions kind of looking into the possible motivations or demotivations for the government that we may come back to later. But first of all, if I could take it in order, again, Kevin, Duncan, Deborah, what do you think is the basic reason why we've seen so little progress on dealing with these problems?
Well, I think if you look post 2010 in terms of the coalition government, I think you had a government in terms of not just doing it with Russia, but also with China, that it was about finance. It was actually about attracting money into the UK. And I think, as we say in the report, and Duncan mentioned it as well, yeah, City of London is very successful, but what price? And I think there are things that possibly in terms of the approach that could be changed is that do you get a situation whereby you turn a blind eye to money laundering and other things, which I think has happened, and some of the enablers that have actually allowed it to happen. So there has been, I think, idea that, well, it's free market, therefore let's try and get money into investment in the country. I think has skewed the agenda. I think alongside that, I think it's a broader issue, not just for this government, but I think also the coalition government and the Theresa May government, is that in terms of prioritisation of these issues and security, I'm not sure it's been a top priority. As Deborah said, there's been a lot of talk about our place in the world and the various reviews in terms of what our defence policy should be and other things. But when it comes to concrete action, there's a lot of talk, but very little action in terms of key policies. And I think in terms of the issue around both the Brexit referendum and interference in that process, I think we used the word in the report. It was a hot potato, didn't want really to go there. I think that's a mistake because I think, as Duncan said, we weren't suggesting in our report, as a lot of people said, that somehow this was about, trying to discredit the referendum result. It's not. It's a wider national security issue about whether you've got a situation where you've got other issue, outside influences, foreign powers interfering in our democratic process.
Thank you very much, Duncan.
Thank you. I think there are a number of thoughts that occur to me as to why some of the recommendations in the report, but also perhaps more widely why, in my opinion, the UK's Russia policy is not in the position it should be. There are a number of factors here. I wouldn't overlook the simple pressure of events of recent years, particularly the pressure of events related to the whole drawn-out process of Brexit, which has squeezed attention spans at the political level and reduced administrative bandwidth across the civil service. And this is going to continue to be a real problem for government going forward. That's overlaid, of course, more recently by the impact, the administrative impact of dealing with COVID-19. But standing back a little, and here again, I want to reiterate a point. I hope I don't sound like a cracked record on this, but I do continue to believe that even now, despite the marked shift in UK policy towards Russia after 2014, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, even now, I am not persuaded, I am not fully persuaded that enough senior policymakers really have as clear-eyed a view of the likely direction of the relationship with Russia as perhaps they should. Now, I'm not talking about Russia here as some sort of existential threat to the UK, but I do think that decision makers need to appreciate better than they have done the depth of some of the very real differences that there are between the UK and Russia over the long term. For example, with regard to the long-term ordering of security in Europe. There's an interesting question there about what the causes of that lack of appreciation is. Perhaps it's because people find the policy implications simply too uncomfortable. Is it about a lack of understanding and appreciation of just how deep and wide the differences are with Russia? Is it a lack of imagination? Is it all of the above? I suspect it may well be an element of all of the above. More specifically, with regard to two issues that were flagged by the ISC report. Why does this issue of anti-money laundering keep recurring? Why is this a recurrent problem for the UK? Sometimes I'm slightly at a loss to explain this. I find it hard not to believe that successive governments have consistently prioritized sectional economic interests over wider national security considerations. I find it hard not to believe that, and unfortunately I tend to arrive at the conclusion that that's still the case. And until such time as the UK is willing to pay some sort of economic price, we are going to continue to be in this situation where we are not doing enough to protect ourselves from the potentially harmful effects of illicit finance. As regards the reason for the refusal to investigate Russian interference in the Brexit referendum, I can only conclude there that the government doesn't want to antagonise members of the Conservative Party and possibly sections of the Brexit supporting electorate. I think it's mistaken.
Yeah, no, I mean, Duncan kind of just is far more qualified than me to talk about in terms of his thoughts about why the UK hasn't taken much stronger action to deal with the illicit money issue, because it undermines our argument every time when in terms of taking a tough line with Russia, as the government says it does, when that's still the case. I think you get the sense that like as Duncan has said, that there isn't real clarity in terms of the future strategy for UK-Russia relations, and people were wondering when Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, would there be a softening of that relationship? You know, we obviously saw after the murder of Alexander Litvinenko in 2006, the UK was heavily criticised for not taking a robust enough response and being way too cautious. And then when you had the Skripal poisoning in 2018, there was a far stronger and faster and more effective response by the UK. Critics still say they didn't go far enough, but in terms of what we've seen the UK do in response to aggressive activity from Russia, alleged aggressive activity from Russia, see, Russia denies it, then the Skripal response is a really good case in hand to see how the UK does have the ability to stand tall and to rally its allies and to take definitive action. That said, when Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, there was a concern that maybe that would soften, and the language that he's used has continued that line of how Russia, the past behaviour is unacceptable, and relations cannot return to normal until Russia stops this kind of unacceptable activity. but you do wonder how long that stance can continue. And I thought it's kind of whistled out a bit in the wake of what happened to Alexei Navalny. But France had that push last year, didn't it? That attempt to try to reset relations with Russia, as happens so frequently. We obviously had that with the Obama administration too. I do think there definitely needs to be a clear vision as to how the UK views its relations with Russia, and once it has set that vision, then to ensure that its behaviours reflect it. Sorry, that's my dog. He agrees.
Deborah, well done for pushing on through the demands for lunch or whatever it was. You brought up a great point, of course, which is that if we think of Litvinenko and the situation before and after Litvinenko, we see that inattention to Russia and misreading of Russia is not just a recent phenomenon for the British government. It goes back so much further, at least to the early 2000s, and we need to, of course, bear that in mind as context. Now, they're all good points about why it might be that so little has been done, and they do echo some of the suggestions that have been made in the chat. Only you put it slightly more politely and charitably than a lot of the people who are writing in the chat. Incidentally, I hope that we are going to be able to capture this chat for later use, because there's a lot of good side discussion going on there as well. Just for the people who can't dial in, let me share some of the highlights of why exactly the UK might be so poor at doing this. For example, James Nixie has come up with, is it money? Is it Kremlin retribution? Is it diplomatic traditional protocol, or anything else? We also have a lot of pointers to dirty money in the chat. Do any of the panelists, asks Samantha DeVenden, feel that a government who elevates the millionaire son of a former officer of the KGB's first director to the House of Lords can be trusted to take any effective action on Russian interference? And much more in that vein, speaking of victims of Russian operations, Stephen Dale, is anyone surprised that the most incompetent government of our lifetimes, led by a serial liar and hell-bent on Brexit, has done virtually nothing about the report? Well, let's not forget, it's not just the current government. It is a long-standing tradition in British policy towards Russia, and it's not just the UK. This is a far more widespread problem. It's just been highlighted specifically at this point. We do have a lot of good conversations going on in the chat, as I mentioned. There was one that came up early, which steps back again from Russia slightly and comes back to a point I tried to make in the introduction, that the vulnerabilities and the gaps in legislation and the problems highlighted in this report are in some cases not specific to Russia. Instead, it could be exploited by a lot of different hostile actors. And this question from Alex Fuchs, who says, to what extent do the panelists feel that this is limited to Russia, and how many other countries might be trying to achieve similar goals? I'm thinking of China and Azerbaijan, which each have very active influence campaigns, albeit in different ways. And Deborah, I suspect that in your day job, this may be something that you've had more exposure to. So if we can tackle this one in reverse order, please. First Deborah, then Duncan, then Kevin, if you want to chip in as well, that'd be great.
Yes, no, definitely. It's not. It's a complete mistake to think this is just a Russia issue. I thought it was interesting. The director general of MI5 made in his sort of public comments that he made recently, talked about Russia as bringing bursts of bad weather, but China changing the climate. And I think it all kind of fits into the way that states interact with each other today. Like, nobody wants to go to war. Like, why go to war when you don't have to? If you can gain the influence that you seek to achieve, or change the dynamics on the ground without ever launching a conventional invasion, if you can do that through these different means, like using social media to amplify divisions in a society, or cyber attacks to erode trust in institutions, or the infiltration of think tanks, and you know the arguments. And it's absolutely not just a Russia problem. I think the problem that all democracies need to get on top of is how to deal with it without eroding our own values. Like, you obviously can't. You wouldn't want to meet like with like, because then we just lose what we value, which is obviously our rule of law and our freedoms and human rights and all these things that make us a liberal democracy, but no one's yet really come up with an answer. And the Baltic states have got good, they understand the nature of the threat in terms of Russia, but it's no one's really come up with a good answer as to how we protect our democracies from these corrosive attacks that really do seek to corrupt our politics, erode our trust in our institutions. And it's all happening really slowly. So, we are being boiled like a frog, which is a line that Lieutenant General Graham Lamb said in my podcast. Not that I'm just plugging my podcast, but it's a good line.
I completely agree. This is not these problems, or some of these problems, are by no means exclusive to Russia. We're talking about Russia because this is a Russia-focused discussion, but we could, I well imagine, talk about other countries as well. So that's an important contextual point to make. I think there are a couple of other related points that I would throw into the mix. When we talk about the potentially damaging effects of illicit capital flows from Russia, or indeed from any other country, we shouldn't jump to the conclusion of assuming that any wealthy Russian coming to the UK is necessarily, by definition, irredeemably corrupt or bent on nefarious activity in the UK. That too would be wholly wrong, and a serious misunderstanding of the nature of the policy problem. There's a third point, I think, which is also relevant to this. And I think it goes back to an earlier observation Deborah made with regard to domestic sources of disinformation during the Brexit referendum campaign. It's really, again, also to reiterate an earlier point I made. To a large extent, dealing with the threats posed by illicit capital inflow, disinformation, the answers to these problems long-term are domestic. They lie here. They lie in terms of how we govern ourselves, how we organise ourselves as a society, how we organise our political system. Just to give one specific example, which I don't think was raised as such in the ISC report, there's a whole set of issues in my mind to do with lobbying legislation in the UK. Many people who are far more expert than I am about this subject will say that the 2014 Lobbying Act is woefully inadequate in terms of imposing a basic level of transparency, providing accurate information about the extent of political lobbying in this country. This is a basic issue about how we organise ourselves as a society and how we regulate the question of the interrelationship between the business world and the political world.
Kevin,
can I just come in terms of the issue around resource and what Duncan just talked about? I mean, I agree. You shouldn't take the view that all foreign capital that comes into the UK, whether it's from Russia or anywhere else, is necessarily, from ill-gotten gains. But there are clear examples of where it is, and I think in terms of our response to it is we've got things like the unexplained wealth orders, which I think is a major step forward. But I think there's resource implications here. I think if you're going to really tackle it, you do need to put the resources behind it, because it's not just in terms of the evidence, it's then quite rightly, long legal process to go through. I think overall, our response to a lot of issues is transparency. And I think in terms of, the recommendations which the House of Lords took on board from the report, we're not saying people are doing anything wrong, but, it's transparent that people can see what legislators and what their relationships are. And I would also go further that I think that is across the board. Transparency seems, I think, to help the process, as opposed to some other states we're dealing with where transparency is not the case. On social media, the genie's out of the bottle on this one. And I think in terms of blaming social media for all the ills in the world, I think is a bit naive, because a lot of it is actually about reinforcing divisions that are already there in society. And I think one thing which we do need to do, and I don't know how we actually do it, is actually argue for democracy in the UK. I mean, the trend recently, for example, even by the government, attacking, you saw the response to the Supreme Court's judgment on, for example, the Brexit decision in terms of the programme of Parliament, attacking judges as though somehow these are political appointments. No, we should be actually making the point of making people understand that an independent judiciary is, a vital cornerstone of our democracy. And I think it's that debate that we need to, and I think the onus is there on us as politicians to keep reiterating that in terms of making sure that what might be seen as quick political wins do have a damage in terms of perceptions about what our democracy is. A free press, I would also argue, is a key cornerstone of our democracy. And I think we need to talk in these terms that, we might not like, for example, what a newspaper writes or what a judge decides in a court, but there's reasons for that. And in a free democracy and a free society, we should be able to ensure they're there. Compare that to, what's happened in the last few days in Russia, for example, in terms of independence of the judiciary, for example. So I think there's a case to be made for our democracy. Is it perfect? No, it's not. But it's certainly damn sight better than the alternatives.
Thank you very much. So the key theme that unites all of that is there are bigger issues at stake than just countering specific Russian issues. And that is, again, one of the reasons why the recommendations that came out in the report are so important, and we need to keep attention on them. The questions are coming in thick and fast in the chat, inevitably. I will have to bundle them together, so my apologies if you feel that you have contributed something and it was underrepresented. That will happen inevitably, I'm afraid, as the clock starts to wind down. Let me take some of the questions together about coming back to the future trajectory of UK-Russia relations, not as the British government would like them to be, not as the Russian government would like them to be, but what you actually think is probable, what is actually going to happen between the two countries. We have a few different questions that have come in on that general theme. A couple of them are about the changes post-Brexit, the two opposing principles that Brexit is both good news for Russia and bad news, and specifically for Russian elites and where they'd like to park their money. We've got two suggestions. First of all, London becomes a more attractive target for dirty Russian money. Secondly, the UK can act without the EU and can enforce different kinds of anti-money laundering legislation and enact sanctions against against Russia itself. So more broadly, how do you see Brexit influencing the relationship in the long term, and is it in fact good news for Russia? And a second theme, which I'm going to throw in there as well, we have a question coming back to that those comments from Graham Lamb, Lieutenant General Graham Lamb, where you may have seen a rejoinder from Mark Galeotti in the Moscow Times, who calls the comparisons he makes misleading and insulting, and suggests that the continued presentation of a Russian threat that is both outsized and out of control is profoundly problematic for the West. Now, whether or not you've actually had a chance to read Mark Galeotti's rejoinder, and if you did, I hope you got a chance to read to the end, because it becomes far more nuanced lower down. Do you think that we are overstating the problem, or do you think that by contrast, we are actually not shouting about it loud enough? I'd be interested in your frank opinions of both of those. And can we go back to the initial order again, please? If we can take Kevin, then Duncan, then Deborah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, should we just focus on Russia? No, we shouldn't. As I said earlier on, I think we all would want good relationships with Russia. And I think, should we get it out perspective? No, we shouldn't. I think in terms of Russia, it's got some huge problems of its own internally in terms of its healthcare systems, its demographics, and economic over-reliance on carbon technologies, for example. But we've also got a situation whereby it has a clear agenda in terms of amplifying its voice. So I agree in one respect not to get too focused on it, but we can't ignore it either. In terms of Brexit, I'm not sure it makes a great deal of difference. I think the bigger issues, I certainly think, are for the UK economy around Brexit. And in terms of where do we go to, I think in terms of Russia, yeah, we've got to keep trying. I think diplomatic, diplomatic relations and trying engagement. But the problem is, as Duncan said, is that while, like the report said, while you've got the present regime in charge, it's a pretty one-way street. So I think we've got to, work with allies to, counter Russia where we can. If there's cooperation which is in the interests, I think, for example, on the vaccine, there's already been some cooperation around COVID vaccines, for example, but they're pretty limited. And do I see a great major change? No, I don't think. I think the more interesting problems are actually internally within Russia itself, and I think question marks in terms of how long what is in place now can actually continue in terms of post-Putin, for example.
Well, look, my view for a long time has been that Brexit makes it a lot more difficult for the UK to deal effectively with Russia. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. I think the starting point is the reality, whether we agree with this or not, that the current Russian leadership does not view the UK as a great power in the global system, unlike Russia. The UK is seen as a major power, but it's very much a second-tier power. Now, because of that, to defend and promote its interests effectively as regards Russia, the UK relies critically on its alliances, working with its partners and its membership of multilateral organisations. Well, what was Brexit all about? Brexit was all about taking the UK out of the multilateral organisation through which much of the UK's Russia policy had been delivered for the best part of a generation. Secondly, as we can see, the process of Brexit, which my reading is far from over yet, is generating political strains in the UK's relationships with its key European partners, which again are going to complicate the formulation of Russia policy, I think, or at least are going to be things that the UK is going to have to devote more attention to in future in order to formulate and implement an effective Russia policy. And then finally, just to repeat some of the things that have been said already, the Brexit campaign in 2016 and the process of extricating the UK from the EU since then have again shone a light on some very deep divisions among the four nations of the UK and within our societies. And from a Russian perspective, the proposition is very simple. If you're domestically divided, you are externally weakened. So Brexit is going to have all sorts of complicating effects on the UK's ability to deal effectively with Russia going forward. Just in terms of whether we are sometimes overstating the Russia problem, if you like, I confess I haven't read the Mark Galeotti article, but in general terms, I certainly agree with the general proposition that we must keep the Russia challenge in some sort of perspective. So I would argue, for example, that Russia faces all sorts of long-term, particularly domestic weaknesses, which a more assertive, more confident foreign policy can't really compensate for over time. Demographic pressures, the prospect of long-term economic stagnation, etc. Moreover, I would argue that much of what Russia does in terms of its foreign policy actually is negative. It actually in some ways undermines Russia's long-term influence and its ability to project influence in the world. It doesn't actually serve Russia's own interests as effectively as it could. So we need to bear that in mind. At the same time, and again, just to repeat something I said earlier, we do need to be clear that the current Russian leadership views the world in terms that are very different from the terms that are more familiar to leaders in the West. And I would expect that core elements of that worldview will almost certainly outlast the current political leadership, because they are a set of propositions that give or take some differences, and there clearly are differences on this question within the elite in Moscow, but core elements of this worldview are broadly shared, and they are going to outlast the current political leadership in Moscow.
Yeah, no, so I totally agree with what Duncan said about the Brexit effect on the UK in terms of its ability, the sort of the leverage that it has. And I also think it goes two ways. It goes to the EU too. Like the UK was such a core voice in helping to shape EU policy against Russia and dealing with the fact that there are a number of EU member states that would much prefer to push to one side the concerns about dropping a bit of Novichok in Salisbury and press on with good economic relations with Russia, and that's partly a reflection of these kind of grey zone Russian activities in those states, but also in terms of the way the states have traditionally had their bilateral relations with Russia. So I think Brexit in that effect has been a great triumph for Russia in terms of, well, it remains to be seen, but it could be a great triumph for Russia in terms of how it's able to operate with the EU. Although I guess the sort of the jury's still out in terms of how Germany is going to, or if it's going to really take a strong line in the wake of the Navalny, the poisoning. The signs so far, while the language has been strong, the actions have not. So perhaps not. And I thought it was interesting with what was happening in Belarus and how the UK was a bit slow perhaps, but much faster than the EU in terms of coming up with sanctions. But again, that does reflect, is Russia going to be bothered about the UK imposing sanctions compared to the whole of the EU imposing sanctions? So again, that's that sort of diminution of the UK effect in terms of imposing cost. And then about the question about, is the threat posed by Russia being exaggerated? And yeah, obviously, and officials always sort of say to me how it's not like it's they're sort of, you mustn't paint the Russian threat as being kind of 10-foot tall bad guys. But I think it's more to do with norms and behaviors as much as anything. And right now, our planet is seeing this battle over values, a battle around a China-centric worldview, and a worldview that has been built up from the end of the Second World War with all the global institutions that we all know so well. And so the more that Russia's activities erode those norms, the more that it kind of doesn't make headlines so much that Novichok was used, chemical weapons are being used. I think that's the bigger threat. And that's why you need to take those activities so seriously. Like Western democracies need to stand up and push back when the rules of law and that rules-based system is being undermined and eroded, because otherwise we all lose.
So again, highlighting the urgency of the problem and how it's not something that you can park while you deal with other issues. And thanks, everybody. There's been a lively discussion developing on the chat, going back to that point about whether Russian money is a problem if it is not directly and obviously linked to Russian state interests. There was an earlier question from Ian Bond, picking up Duncan's point about overestimating the number of pro-Putin Russians in London. Does that mean we should be less worried about the influence of Russian-originated wealth in British politics, as long as those who use it aren't close to Putin? And there's been a strong consensus coming through ever since then in the chat that actually, no, it is a problem, because knowledgeable people are suggesting that if, for example, Samantha de Benden, Timothy Ash, if you are a source of significant Russian money, then you are of interest to the Russian authorities, and you do have a potentially pernicious influence on politics. Plus, it's been pointed out, Her Majesty's government is not terribly good at filtering out who is in fact part of the leadership elite and who is opposing it. There was a second part, though, to Ian Bond's earlier question, and this is specifically for Kevin Jones, and it's a related issue about countering influence, and specifically that influence on politicians, because let's not forget, politicians may declare the donations they receive, but they are unlikely to declare what they're supposed to do in return for those donations. And Ian's question runs, the appointment of Yevgeny Lebedev to the House of Lords is controversial. Fair enough. Is there more that the parliamentary authorities / MPs / peers can do to vet and veto such nominations if there seems to be a potential national security angle? And let's broaden it out just from nominations to the House of Lords. In general, how much can be done to prevent people who should not be in those positions of influence arriving in them?
Well, don't get me started on how to launch reform, because I have a very robust view about it in terms of its future existence. But no, in terms of the influence that people have, is transparency is an important part of that. And I think if you are going to sit in any type of legislator, it's got to be clear in terms of what your relationships are or sources of income are. And I think in terms of the issue I think Duncan made is we've got to be careful we don't get into things that just because someone's Russian, it means that their wealth is, come from sources that are illegal. But it comes back to that point about, I think Duncan made, was about the robustness of the way in which we do ask those questions. And as I say, we've got legislation, things like unexplained wealth orders. But I think that is an issue around political will, but also about finance. If you're going to clamp down on that, you're going to have to put the money behind that, and whether there is a political will to do it. But we've also, seen attempts directly in terms of things like the Conservative Friends of Russia, which was a clear front for, pro-Putin, pro-Russian propaganda. And I think it is important that, again, source of finance those individuals and organisations have got to be made transparent. The thing that I find sometimes a little bit concerning with the present government is that you see some amounts of money donated, for example, the Conservative Party, they're mind-boggling, really, in terms of, and whether or not some people should be asking some ethical questions about whether they should be accepting that money or not. I think it's something that should be borne in mind. But no, I think in terms of stopping the, whether it's not just Russian, but other money coming into this country and being used, through either money laundering or influence, that there is legislation there. We just need to start using it and put the finance behind to do it.
Thank you. Yes, so will and resources, as we've heard already highlighted. In just a few minutes, I'm going to be asking each of our panelists just to have a closing 90 seconds, couple of minutes, any additional thoughts that they wanted to lob into the mix. But just very, very briefly, before we do that, there's another theme that's been coming through good and strong on the chat. And that is the topic that I introduced right at the beginning, the malign influence that is undercover, that is not a paid agent of influence, but somebody who is promoting the Russian agenda. We just heard about the Conservative Friends of Russia, which is particularly upfront example. But we have conversations here about the Russian lobbying regime in the city, media, academia, think tanks. And there's a question slightly further back in the chat. Where should we look for more information on the infiltration of think tanks? And I'm going to pass this back to both Deborah and Duncan very, very briefly. But I would suggest that at the moment, the crippling handicap in terms of identifying this is that even though we know it happens, because it is perfectly legal and perfectly normal, it is very difficult to actually point to it as a real problem. After all, if you know that one of your colleagues is in fact working for Moscow, who do you say this to and what do you do about it? Because he's not actually technically doing anything wrong. Duncan, any thoughts on that very briefly before we start to wrap?
Well, very briefly, I guess this relates to an earlier issue that came up in passing, which is one of the recommendations in the ISC report about a FARA type law for the UK. Well, I think from memory, I think the ISC referred to this without making a specific recommendation, but it was something that they certainly discussed. Now, I've got mixed feelings about this. On the surface, it seems to make sense, again, in the interest of transparency, because I agree with Kevin very strongly here that transparency is a really important organising principle for our policy. As I understand FARA, which has been amended several times over the years to focus much more clearly on political lobbying, the key issue is this question of entities or groups who are believed to be acting at the directional control of a so-called foreign principle and engaging primarily in political lobbying. It seems to me that as a general proposition, that is a an important debate we need to have as a matter of some urgency now. Now, two caveats to that. First of all, I think if we do go down this path, and I don't have a firm view on that, it will be really important to make sure that any new legislation includes real safeguards to prevent the possible politicization of such a law, to protect, for example, NGOs, media outlets. And there have been a number of FARA-related controversies in the US in recent years about this. So we need to be very careful about that. There's a wider question, which I touched on earlier, and I don't have the answer. Is this an issue that would be better addressed through reform of the 2014 Lobbying Act? Question.
Thank you. Deborah, any key points there?
Well, I think it's crazy that we don't have a Foreign Agent Registration Act. It would be, because like you said in your kind of introduction to the question, people aren't breaking it's not that they're breaking the law. It's more just helping. This is all about influence, isn't it? And it's more about understanding why someone has a particular stance. Are they impartial, or are they perhaps being funded by a certain state? And I just think it would just make the more transparency you have around those sorts of things, the better. So I do think that the benefits outweigh the risks.
Thank you very much, Deborah. We are now hurtling towards our closing time, so we will have to wrap it up. I will invite rather than request each of the panelists to chip in a final minute or two if there's anything you wanted to share. And there is a request in the chat, in fact, for that closing remarks. And Maxine David makes the point that there's plenty of work to be done in terms of a whole population challenge, because as Deborah, you say in your podcast, in this kind of warfare, nobody is too unimportant to be a target. And I wonder where you could have got that phrase from. But Maxine says, if the speakers could say in their super brief closing remarks, what we as ordinary people might contribute in addressing any of these challenges, it would be great to hear. So hands up, who would like to have a quick stab at that in a minute or so?
There's a great deal I could say, but I'll confine myself to one comment. I think we need to expect a lot more from our elected representatives. I think there's specifically, it is simply unacceptable that the government is able to delay publication of such an important report, as Kevin indicated, for reasons which, to my mind, really are still unclear. That is simply unacceptable. We need to send that message, it seems to me. More generally, there are ways in which I think ordinary citizens in the UK should be expecting greater transparency with regard to the interrelationship between business and politics generally in the UK. This goes way beyond the issue of the potentially corrupting effect of illicit Russian finance. This comes down to how are we prepared to create a transparent, sustainable, long-term basis that regulates the lobbying industry. The two ideas.
Thank you. Kevin, you had your hand up as well. I doubt you're going to disagree with either of those.
No, I don't. I think it's pretty simple. I think the issue is this: we take democracy for granted, and what we need to do is make a case for democracy, even with all its with all its imperfections, and that needs to be done, I think, across the piece. And I think the other issue is about transparency. And in terms of recommendations from the report, there are two. There's obviously the Official Secrets Act, which needs to be updated. And I think in terms of a Foreign Agents Registration Act, that would also add to that transparency. I don't think you can get to a situation where you ban foreign governments from ever lobbying or promoting themselves in this country. That way would be wrong. But at least you need the transparency to know who's funding and what the thinking is behind it.
Absolutely. Deborah, any final closing thought?
Yeah, I just think a better job needs to be done of explaining what the threat looks like and how everybody has a responsibility to protect democracy and to actually care about democracy, realise that it actually matters. There's not enough trust anymore in government. There's not enough trust in politicians. There's not trust in the media. So much damage has already been done. And I worry that it's going to take a big shock to actually wake the public up, or wake people up, wake us all up, wake our society up to the fact, like Kevin said, that we shouldn't take our freedoms for granted. And that conversation is just not being had sufficiently. And also not in the right language. Like, people use complicated language like sub-threshold threats and character of conflict and things like that don't mean anything to people. So to try to have a language, to have a debate in a way that's accessible, I think is really, really necessary.
Deborah, all our panelists, thank you very much. We've got some key recommendations to take away, and I see James Nixie, head of the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House, nodding. I think he feels a written product coming on, trying to summarize some of this. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a really meaty discussion with an impressively high signal to noise ratio, and thank you to everybody who joined in for that. Apologies once again to those who asked perfectly decent questions, but we didn't have time to fit them in. I suspect we could have gone on for hours. But in any case, thank you very much indeed for joining us, and in a special thank you and a virtual round of applause to our panelists, and we will see you at the next event. Goodbye.